Roman legions were certainly large, but when several of these got together with their auxiliary units, the true size of such armies were absolutely massive. However, what is even more impressive is the logistical nightmare it took to get such forces from point A to point B. Today, we will bring this feat to life by simulating the 24-hour cycle of shuffling 50,000 beings a distance greater than the Straits of Gibraltar, or 76% the narrowest width of the English Channel. This is the true size of a Roman army on the march.
The organization of a Roman army on the march required the strategic coordination of its various units to operate effectively. You can also pull together a team of soldiers for your own campaigns of conquest by picking from hundreds of champions through our sponsor Raid Shadow Legends, available on mobile and PC. Raid's been doing a great job when it comes to scratching my itch for on-the-go dungeon diving, boss fights, arena battles, and more. And what's really great is the game is always evolving, always adding new content, and has a ton of replayability. The latest boss, for instance, is the Hydra, whose 6 heads each bring a different challenge to the fight. For instance, the head of Suffering comes with damage reflection for your attacks, the head of Blight poisons your team with debuffs, and the head of Torment strips you of your turns and skills if you can't hide from its True Fear ability. It's a truly brutal fight, which will definitely put your skills to the test. For a leg up in the battle, you can claim the free, legendary champion Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, by logging into the game any 7 days between now and October 23rd. Other champions joining the roster include new Mythic tier characters, who come with the Metamorph mechanic to change forms for even more dynamic abilities. New players will even get a chance to get one of the best epic champions, Stag Knight, as well as a skin for him designed by JonTron himself. Just use the promo code JTSkin before October 7th. Also, if you click my link or scan the QR code right here, you'll get a free starter pack with this cool in-game loot. So just hit my link in the description below, and I'll see you all on the battlefield.
Before we begin, it is important to note the highly reconstructive nature of our model. While the Roman army is one of the best documented forces of ancient history, there is much we don't know. The devil is often in the details, and the particulars of things like unit compositions, troop spacings, and march practices have long been debated. A few authors and books which helped guide us include the following: The Roman Army by Peter Connolly, The Roman Army at War by Adrian Goldsworthy, The Roman War Machine by John Peddy, and The Logistics of the Roman Army at War by Jonathan Roth. While these formed the academic basis for our episode today, we ultimately ended up synthesizing much of what they report in order to perform our own calculations. This was made possible by the analytical framework established by Gary Brueggemann in his extensive blog regarding the models of the Roman legion. Without these folks, today's episode would not have been possible. But now, with well-deserved credits out of the way, we can get started. To ground our study, let's begin with the basic mechanics of the march. Marching speed is a good point to start, as fundamental human physics have not changed much over the eras. The cadence for modern armies is around 100 to 120 BPM. This seems to align with a passage from Vegetius, which points in the direction of the idea that the regular march speed for infantry was roughly 100 paces per minute, while the quick march cadence was 120 paces per minute. Assuming a pace of about 0.76 meters, you therefore end up with a regular speed of 4.6 kilometers an hour and a quick speed of 5.5 kilometers an hour. So, at this rate, how far would an army travel in a day? From a practical perspective, we can assume that a maximum figure would be from sunrise to sunset. But we must remember that daylight hours vary based on the time of the year and your latitude. For perspective, here is a daylight chart for Rome, and here is a daylight chart for London. In our video, let's assume a roughly Mediterranean latitude around the middle of the campaign season, which results in about 14 hours of potential daylight. Thus, using our prior marching rates, we can calculate an upper limit for march distances of around 65 kilometers at a regular pace and 75 kilometers at a quick pace. In theory, this daily target can be achieved. However, it is not something that a foot-based force can sustain on a regular basis. After all, they need to rest, eat, and relieve themselves. An often quoted metric is that a healthy human can walk about 30 to 50 kilometers or 20 to 30 miles per day. Indeed, Vegetius reports that Roman military training involved having soldiers march 20 Roman miles in 5 hours during the summer. So now we are definitely getting closer to a reasonable answer for how long and how far an army marched in a typical day. But these are still rather idealized figures and miss a rather critical factor: logistics. Ancient armies, after all, were like cities on the move. Tens of thousands of men and animals crawled at the speed of their slowest element, with careful coordination being required to avoid traffic jams. In addition, an army on the move had to deal with scouting, protection, traffic, encampment, foraging, food preparation, and more. Thus it was that a Roman army on the move adopted a specific schedule and order of march. We will cover this in greater detail shortly. For now, the basic concept to understand is that a column was like a giant snake which began coiled up in camp at the start of the day, slowly unraveled itself as it advanced, and then recoiled itself at the next camp at the end of the day. In this metaphor, the head of the snake leaves the first camp long before the tail does. Similarly, the head arrives at the second camp long before the tail finally comes to a rest. The longer the snake, the more daylight is wasted coiling itself at the start and end of each day. Past a certain size, the snake spends very little of its time actually advancing. This hopefully makes it clear why large armies could be so slow. To combat this phenomenon, large armies would often break themselves into smaller groups and disperse to ease the logistical burdens of travel and foraging. Commanders therefore had to find the right trade-off between the strength and agility of a battle group. For the Roman army, the compromise seems to have been around 4 legions. This was, after all, the standard size of a consular force of the Republic. But during the imperial era, things were less rigid, and there was certainly no hard and fast rule. Ultimately, this is just a convenient assumption for our model. But before we simulate this army on the march, let's understand its size. A typical early imperial legion at full strength is estimated to have boasted around 5,120 legionaries, 120 cavalry, 310 officers, 35 specialists, 1,600 slaves, 1,900 mules, and 128 horse spares. These were led by a command staff of about 12. Now multiply these figures by 4 for our legionary army group. These would have been helmed by a general, his bodyguard, support staff, and all their gear. But that was not all. The infantry-heavy force of Rome was often accompanied by auxiliary troops, which helped both increase their numbers and round out their capabilities. However, the size and composition of such a support force would vary greatly based on the needs of a campaign. For our model, we will assume the legions are joined by 4 cohorts of auxiliary archers, each of which numbered around 500, for a total of about 2,000 Sagittarii, with their own officers, support, and gear. We will also assume that the legions are joined by 8 army of auxiliary cavalry, each of which is broken into 16 of the 32-man termi. Together, this mounted force numbers about 4,100 auxiliary cavalry in addition to their accompanying support elements. By placing this entire group end to end with 4 soldiers across to fit the width of most roads, and 1.2 meters between rows, you get the dimensions of our Roman army snake. It stretches out around 25 kilometers or 15.5 miles and takes 5.5 hours to unfurl at a regular pace. We should also mention that the main army snake was accompanied by other snakes as well, namely the camp followers, livestock, the supply lines, and perhaps additional allied armies. For the purposes of this video, we will be excluding these from our model. With this as our basis, let us now simulate its movement on a typical day's march. We can begin in the pre-dawn hours. The Roman army is in camp. A portion of its legionaries are awake on duty as part of the 4th and final watch of the night. But they are not the only ones safeguarding the camp. Beyond the walls roam various units of Rome's reconnaissance force. Within roughly a day's march operate patrols of mounted procursores, which act as a close screening force. Beyond these are the exploratores, which act as scouts. And yet further afield are the speculatores, which act as long-range spies. Together, they operate as the eyes and ears of the army. Reports constantly flow back to the commander, which will ultimately be used to determine the route an army will take for its march and where it will encamp. By the time the sun rises, this will have already been determined, and the necessary orders issued to the officers of the force. We will assume today's march is a 20-kilometer or 12.5-mile journey over a linear stretch of flat land executed at a regular pace. Around 5 a.m., the sky begins to glow dimly. The army stirs as men shuffle about to prepare meals, take care of the animals, and pack up. Soon, troops start to form ranks in the open spaces of the camp. Around 6 a.m., the first elements of the marching column depart. This will be the scouts composed of 1 army of auxiliary cavalry and 2 cohorts of auxiliary archers, for a total of about 500 cavalry and 1,000 archers. This group, loosely arranged, stretches out over 1 kilometer and takes 14 minutes to exit camp. We will assume that once the last of their ranks have left, they are given a roughly 20-minute head start to properly act as a buffer between anything they might encounter and the rest of the army. As the scouts advance, their activities will include probing for enemy troops, flushing out ambushes, removing traps, and clearing the road of obstacles. Such activities will be key for ensuring that the rest of the column can advance as smoothly as possible. By 6:30 a.m., the scouts are about 1 kilometer out, and the Vanguard has now marshaled. It is composed of 1 ala of auxiliary cavalry, 4 termi of legionary cavalry, and an entire legion. They are a formidable force of roughly 640 cavalry and 5,430 infantry, which will be prepared to handle anything the scouts cannot. To further enhance their ability to react quickly, they have left their support staff and gear behind with the baggage train. As this force begins to leave camp, the auxiliaries will take flank positions while the legionary infantry and cavalry will stretch out in a column over 2 kilometers and take 27 minutes to fully exit. Once this has been achieved, an extra minute is allowed to elapse to give them a bit of breathing room before the next group departs. By 7 a.m., the Surveyors are now ready to move. They consist of the army's engineers and half a legion's worth of soldiers, for a total of around 2,800 men. Traveling without baggage, it will be their job to advance quickly and begin laying out the new camp. While on the march, they measure 1 kilometer in length and take 13 minutes to exit camp. Once again, another minute of breathing room is granted before the next group departs. By 7:15 a.m., the command element of the army is ready to leave. They consist of the general, his entourage, a cohort of mounted bodyguards, and all of their support staff. Altogether, they number about 620 men and 100 mules. When in marching order, they measure 750 meters and take 10 minutes to exit camp. For reference, this means that by the time the command element is on the road, there are already 10,000 men ahead of him, with the lead scouts operating more than 5 kilometers out. At this distance, it would take a rider galloping at 40 kilometers an hour about 7.5 minutes to ride from the tip of the column back to the command force. Thus we see that the general was fairly well insulated from the dangers which might lay ahead, but still remained close enough to keep control over the situation. After another 1-minute buffer, the next part of the marching column will be ready to depart around 7:25 a.m. This is the main body of heavy infantry, composed of 2.5 legions, along with their embedded baggage train and support staff. Altogether, they number 13,600 legionaries, 4,000 slaves, and 4,750 mules. On the march, they measure an impressive 8.4 kilometers long and take 1 hour and 50 minutes to leave. During this time, much of the camp will have been emptied, with most of its structures broken down for transport. By 9:15 a.m., the last of the main body has left. A few extra minutes are given as a buffer, such that by around 9:20 a.m., the baggage train can depart. This group is equally as massive. It contains the baggage for the 4 auxiliary archer cohorts, the 8 auxiliary cavalry army, and the 1.5 legions, which we have assumed march unencumbered elsewhere in the column for greater maneuverability. In addition, the baggage train hosts the medical carts, the siege carts, miscellaneous support staff, and all the spare horses. Together, they number about 3,700 men, 4,200 mules, and 4,600 horses. This is the single largest block of the entire army on the march. In ideal conditions, they stretch just over 8.5 kilometers and take almost 2 hours to leave camp. However, given the fact that the baggage train is made of non-soldiers and animals, they are likely less efficient at marching than their legionary counterparts and could have easily taken far more space and time to advance. After all, there was a reason they were called the impedimenta. If things remain on schedule, then by about 11:10 a.m. the rear guard can emerge. In our model, we assume they are composed of 2 army of auxiliary cavalry and 2 cohorts of auxiliary archers. Neither have the baggage or support staff in the event that they need to move or fight quickly. This force numbers about 1,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. Together, they can defeat or at least delay most threats in time for help to arrive. As they get on the road, they will extend about 1.5 kilometers and take 20 minutes to leave the now fully evacuated site of the old Roman camp. Ahead of them lies a road which by this point must have been transformed into a rutted and trodden mess of mud and animal excrement. This will not be a pleasant march in sandals. It is now 11:30 a.m., a full 5.5 hours since the first troops departed. But there is another important group we have yet to mention: the flank guard. It is composed of the remaining 4 army of auxiliary cavalry and 12 termi of legionary cavalry. Together they number around 2,400 riders. But rather than form up in a group within the marching column, we will assume that they have trickled out of camp over time to operate in a series of small units which help patrol the vulnerable sides of the army, especially around the defenseless baggage train. Zooming out, we can now attempt to fully appreciate the mind-blowing scale of a Roman army on the march. To recap, it is composed of the scouts, the Vanguard, the Surveyors, the command group, the main body, the baggage train, and the rear guard, along with the roaming elements of the flank guard. Altogether, they measure just about 25 kilometers or 15.5 miles long in ideal conditions. For context, that's exactly the distance from the Roman Colosseum to the shores of the Mediterranean. Using other geographic comparisons, that's 160% the width of the Straits of Gibraltar, which separates Spain from Africa, or 76% the narrowest width of the English Channel, which separates Britain from France. Put another way, the Roman army covers 60% the total distance of a marathon. This means that for the fastest marathon runner who completed their race in about 2 hours, it would take them 1 hour and 12 minutes to run the length of our Roman army. For a horse at a gallop, this feat would take 38 minutes. However, while the entire army is 25 kilometers long, we have assumed that the planned distance of the day's march is just 20 kilometers. Therefore, by the time the scouts arrive at the site of the second camp at around 10:22 a.m., the baggage train is just over halfway done leaving the first camp. The army is so large that it more than spans both locations. With this in mind, let's now focus on the activities which take place at the new camp. Around 10:30 a.m., all the scouts have arrived and will now fan out to form a screen around the site. Around 11 a.m., the Vanguard will arrive and take up defensive positions. Around 11:15 a.m., the Surveyors arrive and begin to lay out the camp. Around 11:30 a.m., the command group arrives and can set up its affairs in the heart of the new camp. Perhaps the general will choose to relax for a moment by eating, drinking, or resting. Around 11:45 a.m., the main body of legionaries arrive. They will be the ones to begin constructing the camp, with individual cohorts being assigned specific sections to work on. Depending on the threat posed by the enemy, some of these soldiers may instead be reassigned as guards to bolster the vanguard. Estimates vary, but scholars generally put the entire construction duration at around 3 to 4 hours under normal circumstances. Therefore, by the time the baggage train begins to arrive at around 1:30 p.m., the camp's perimeter ditch, rampart, and palisade should be well on their way to being completed by the time the baggage train finishes trickling in at around 3:30 p.m. Within the next half hour, the rear guard will have also arrived. Now, with the defences finished and the rest of the army safe inside, the Vanguard may retire inside the camp to join their comrades. Throughout the afternoon, there would have been a flurry of activity within the camp as people set up tents, unloaded animals, and stored their belongings. The regular structure of the army camp would have made this process second nature for the men and thus greatly facilitated the process. But the work did not stop there. Around 4 p.m., groups are sent out to forage the food, water, and fodder necessary to sustain the army. At the same time, food is being prepared, and around 6 p.m., the evening meal is consumed. Around 7 p.m., various camp chores are completed, and individuals can relax or pursue personal tasks. By 8 p.m., the animals have been secured for the night, and beds are made. At 9 p.m., the sun has set. After a long day, the army can finally rest. That is, except for those men who have been selected for the first watch of the night. Yet they too will be able to sleep soon, once their shift is up and the torch is passed on to those of the next watch. Eventually, the sun will rise and the daily cycle will repeat. Such is the monotonous familiarity of a Roman army on the march until it reaches its objective. I hope that by displaying the true size of a Roman army on the march, you have gained a better understanding of ancient logistics and an appreciation for why the Romans were so keen to build roads across their empire. I hope that you can also now imagine what things might have looked like under less ideal conditions, as would occur in Teutoburg Forest. Stay tuned for future true size episodes as we explore more fascinating topics. To support the channel, consider heading over to our Patreon to participate in polls, catch script previews, and get HD downloads of all our art. We owe a huge debt to our current patrons for funding the channel and to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We certainly couldn't have done it without this team and this community. So be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.